Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It's so nice seeing all of you here today for our presentation, and it has a lot to do with, these are our consultants, Gerard Fromm, Lapp, who's up on the screen. Hi, Daryl. And and they've come to help us with their college health and counseling service, consulting and blending health services and university counseling and integration process, as well as with our SAMHSA grant, which also hopes to help with that. So the presentation today hopefully will help more people feel involved, transparently understand how we're looking at doing what we're doing, and maybe bring some things to ask questions about later on as well. So thank you again for all coming, and try to get started because we only have so much time, but thank you all again for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Dean, and thanks, Nell and Jess and Lou and everybody for having us again. Today, what we'd like to do, Nell thought it would be particularly useful for us to kind of review some of our thinking and learning that has occurred over the last decade or more, actually. As you know, I come from working in college health for the last 20 years, and Jerry Fromm comes from organizational development, organizational dynamics, and Daryl works in higher ed law. And the three of us over this last decade have found ways to collaborate around thinking about what gets in the way of good care in a college setting. And so that's where our work has been, and that's what our work is about here with you. And it brings up the issues of confidentiality and mission, which are the ones we want to try to talk a little bit about with you today. So this is just a summary of some of the topics that we've worked on and in our journey of learning about this. Back in 2003, I was giving presentations on integration, collaboration of medical psych services back then, and then moved on to start talking about at-risk students and the kind of sharing of information that needs to happen around at-risk activities. And then Daryl, who joined in, Daryl actually is counsel at Williams College, where I was the director of psych services. We started working together about these mandatory leave of absences. Again, what kind of information do we need to share? What are the impediments to sharing? And how do we think about that? And then Jerry, who also has worked at the Austin Riggs Center in Stockbridge for a couple decades, more than a couple decades, also ran a college counseling conference every year that we collaborated about. And so the three of us got together there to talk with primarily counseling staff about how do you deal with at-risk students, anticipating, trying to intervene early by sharing appropriate information and so forth. We carried that into the ACHA meeting down in Orlando. Daryl and I did that because this topic is a thorny topic. And it's plagued colleges and health services for a long time, and still plagues them in some ways. So try to get clarity about that. Then we realized that it's not only the legal parts of this, it's how in a college setting there are so many people that have relationships with students. There are multiple roles that people have, multiple conversations that are having with students all the time, from the dean's office to the chaplain's office to the athletic department. And how do you begin to find ways to have meaningful and respectful ways of collaborating around those conversations, again, to minimize risk and to further the mission of higher education, which we'll talk much more about later, which is all about helping young people integrate aspects of themselves to become a whole person. And so there's a way in which college is a perfect setting for how do you model this in your organization and in your services so that students start seeing it as a model of integration, even if they are not talking with you about it. And then we realized that in those conversations with multiple roles and multiple conversations, there's a lot of babble there's a lot of things that we speak different languages. We have clinical languages, we have residential life languages, and how do you decipher and find the appropriate ways of sharing information, again, towards this larger mission of enhancing student development. So we talked about Babel and responding to at-risk students. Jerry and I did a conference about those students that are frozen and deer in the headlight students that aren't accessing any of these services, and how do you begin to find meaningful ways to engage them, and so forth. And then this is kind of congealed over the last few years because we've gotten clear that there's several thorny issues that get in the way of integration and collaboration. But these are kind of the most common ones that come up at every college. First is this whole process of the principle of confidentiality and how that has been so central in the working of medical care, psychotherapy care, and in law actually. And then how each guild within all of the different fields that conducts counseling or therapy, they all have slightly different models about the ethics of confidentiality, from the American Psychiatric all the way to the American College Counseling. We'll talk a little bit about that later. And then there's a lot of misperception about the legal constraints of what is actually allowable for sharing information, and that Darrell will talk a lot about. And then, of course, the concern is how do you do all this sharing of information and yet maintain the important alliance we have with students in treatment so that they feel like they can have confidence that you're handling their information respectfully and usefully. It's not secretly, but it's in a confidential, confident way. And then there are philosophical differences, of course, about the duality and the medicalization of students or patients that sometimes gets in the way, and various models of care that different people feel are most appropriate in this setting as well. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the phenomenon of confidentiality in terms of the definition being an ethical principle of discretion that's associated with the professions of medicine, law, and psychotherapy. So it's about discretion. It's not about thou shalt not. And discretion and clinical judgment are huge factors in thinking about the topic of confidentiality. And assuring that information is accessible to people that need it, and only to those people that should have access. And it's not an all or none phenomenon that Darrell will talk some more about. And so over the years, trying to look at what are some of the major areas of conflict that get in the way of, particularly around the thorny issue of confidentiality. These are kind of the major ones that we've come across. Number one, are you joining the mission of higher education, or are you more wed to the mission of doing psychotherapy? A private practice model, for example. And so finding a way to how does our care join the mission of the larger institution is a huge area that gets in the way of people kind of thinking about the sharing of information. And then obviously, again, any clinician is wearing multiple hats on a college campus. They're on various student of concern committees, they're liaison with the various offices of the college, and sometimes they're in the role of therapist, sometimes they're in the role of administrator, sometimes they're in all these different roles, and they have to balance that. And one of the ways to balance it is to sort of just assume the position that I don't say anything. That's the easiest way to do it, and I'll talk more about that. And obviously, how to talk about students at risk is one of the areas that there's been conflict, but that's kind of sadly, because of college tragedies and so forth, that's gotten much easier for colleges. Everybody now kind of agrees that when somebody's at risk, then you can share information. I don't think there's much controversy about that. The more controversial one is, what about students of concern? And how do you define concern? And when in that process, with a student that's not at risk but is showing evidence of concern either in their not keeping appointments or in their dietary practices or in the various reports that are coming up from the college, when are they of sufficient concern that we would intervene in a college setting, which you might not do, you wouldn't do in a private practice setting. There you would wait. And then, of course, around the issues of integrating medical and counseling services, that is an issue that a lot of services don't join because they feel like there's different standards for confidentiality, which I don't think is true. But that is a thorny issue, and we have some of it here, but less so, I think. And then I added sexual assault because the Title IX has changed all of that in the reporting structures, so the sharing of information around sexual assault is important and complicated, and is something that's getting worked out at all colleges now, and how that's eventually going to settle down, we'll see. All right, so at this point I want to turn it over to Daryl up there on the screen, and I'll click when you want me to click, Daryl, who brings just some of the legal aspects of this that make it sort of clear and will help us think about it. So Daryl?
Okay, thanks, John. So as John mentioned, I have the outside legal counsel role with Williams, and I also have that role with a number of other schools, mostly here in Massachusetts, although a couple of them are in New York. I do work with MIT and Harvard and Tufts, Northeastern, and a bunch of other schools here in Boston. Much of that involves student affairs work of some kind or another, not all of it, and a lot of that student affairs work involves privacy issues, disability compliance issues, and dealing with students who are at risk or of concern in one way or another. The work that I do is both at the policy level, sort of helping schools figure out what they want to do in relation to at-risk committees, students of concern committees, behavioral threat assessment teams, and so on. I also work with schools in relation to specific cases, specific difficult cases where the question is, should the student be put on an involuntary leave or not? Should they be allowed to return following a leave or not? Occasionally we get into the question of should parents be brought into the situation over the student's objection or otherwise without the student's consent, those sorts of things. And then I also litigate. I'm a litigator by training, and sometimes when these cases go sideways, either with a tragic student outcome or a complaint of discrimination by a student, I'll work with the school in defending them and the individuals who work there at the administrative agency or in court. So that's the nature of the work that I do. And in doing that work over the last 20 years or so, and in talking a lot with John and Jerry over the last 10 years or so, I've come to the view that when we're talking about these really difficult student cases, the legal issues fundamentally fall into these two buckets that you see up on this screen here: the compliance issues and the risk management issues. When I say compliance issues, I'm talking about just day-to-day compliance, mostly with the anti-discrimination laws, the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, both of which put certain constraints on our ability to deal with students in certain ways. Sometimes those are affirmative constraints, accommodations that we're legally required to offer. Sometimes they're negative restraints, things that we can't do. We can't withdraw students involuntarily except in certain circumstances without violating their disability rights. And as John mentioned, Title IX is, of course, the hottest of the hot topics in the world of compliance these days. Privacy laws, we do a lot of work in the area of compliance with FERPA and the various different sources of legal requirements that apply to medical and mental health professionals, rape crisis counselors, and to some extent, depending upon the state that you're in, campus police as well. So compliance is big bucket number one, and big bucket number two is the risk management. bucket. How do we manage the risks that we face in deciding whether or not to separate a student from the institution or separate the student from housing, deciding whether to allow a student to return to the institution or to housing. There are risks here of claims of discrimination and wrongful treatment of other kinds. And of course, there's also the risk of litigation if a student tragedy occurs. And I've had the opportunity to see cases from that perspective as well, including the Shin case at MIT, which is one of the more notorious student suicide cases. But I've done other suicide cases, student overdose cases, other death cases involving students with mental health injuries. And I'll say more in just a moment about some of the common threads that run through those cases. So John, next slide, please. So in my view, this big issue that John has introduced for us, the issue of coordinating our efforts and sharing information, these are really essential issues from the lawyer's perspective. They are essential on the compliance front. If we're talking about, again, leaves, returns, these sorts of difficult issues, disability accommodations, what resources are we going to offer or not offer to victims or alleged victims of sexual assault? If we're talking about those questions in the context of a student that you all are caring for, someone who is a patient of the health services, a client of the mental health services, then there's got to be almost invariably some degree of coordination and information sharing, not only as between the medical and mental health providers, but between those clinicians also and the student administrators, who are going to be the ones who make the ultimate judgments. Whether a student goes on an involuntary leave, whether we grant an accommodation or not, whether we allow a student to return, and if so, under what conditions, those ultimate decisions get made by student affairs administrators, not by clinicians. But if we're talking about a student who's in your care, those decisions have got to be informed to some degree by clinical information and judgment. As John mentioned, that's not an all or nothing proposition, but some amount of relevant sharing we certainly need to have occur if we're going to do this in a good and proper way. Next slide. The issue of coordination and information sharing also is absolutely critical on the risk management front. As I mentioned just a moment ago, I've been involved in and certainly studied any number of cases arising out of student tragedies, and I can tell you that every single one of those cases has information sharing, information coordination somewhere at its core. It is without exception one of the themes of these cases. The student tragedy occurred, and the plaintiff's counsel argues, if only the right hand knew what the left hand was doing. All of the pieces to this puzzle were there and available, but the institution never had anyone who was responsible for putting those pieces together. And if only someone had picked up all the puzzle pieces that were available and assembled them, the picture of what needed to happen in relation to this student would have emerged immediately. Now, sometimes that's just advocacy and it's not really the truth, but the fact is that is what these cases tend to be about. And so from a risk management perspective as well, sharing information in appropriate ways at appropriate times is absolutely a key thing to do from the institution's perspective and from the perspective of protecting individual administrators and individual clinicians from claims against them personally. So let's go to the next slide. What I've not identified as one of the two big buckets is legal issues around privacy and confidentiality. And I've come to that view over the years because even though the legal issues are everywhere in some regards, they are not simply a significant matter of legal dimension. You do not see privacy claims brought by students at risk, students of concern, students about whom the institution takes some action or makes some effort in order to help them or address their issues in one way or another. You just don't see these brought forward as legal claims. Of course, we need to pay attention to the law. We need to understand what it is and what it does in terms of constraining our behavior. But we should not be paralyzed by fear of claims of violating somebody's privacy rights. You just do not see these claims. What you do see, unfortunately, as John mentioned, is a lot of misconceptions about what the law is, misconceptions about who can share what with whom and under what circumstances. So let's quickly trot through what the key legal parameters are at an educational institution. If we're talking about privacy at a college or university, of course, we're talking about FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. I'm sure you all are well familiar with that. This has been on the books for several decades now. The primary federal law that relates to student privacy. It broadly applies to all information that directly relates to a student, is contained in any kind of record, whether paper or electronic or video or some other form, and a record that is maintained by the educational institution or somebody working on behalf of the educational institution. If that sounds very broad, it is. The starting point of FERPA is that any record we maintain that contains personally identifiable information about a student, that's a FERPA record as a starting point. FERPA sets out a couple of basic ground rules. Number one, students have the right to see what's in their own records. And secondly, school officials are prohibited from disclosing either the records or information from the records without the student's consent, except where you can do it without their consent. And there are a lot of situations in which that actually is permitted. Next slide. So among the permitted disclosures under FERPA are, number one, consent. And this is one that people often skip over too quickly. There is not a confidentiality issue in the world that can't be solved without the consent of the person whose information we're talking about. And often that consent can be had and will be had. And if we can get the student's consent to disclose certain information to certain people, we've solved the problem under FERPA and frankly any other law that we could think about. Even if we don't get the student's consent, FERPA allows great sharing of information within the institution. FERPA allows sharing any student information to other school officials, which means, broadly speaking, anybody else at the school who reasonably needs the information in order to do their job. So from a FERPA perspective, there's very little in the way of constraints about sharing student information within people at the institution. FERPA also allows certain disclosures to parents that you see here. If the student is a dependent for tax purposes, you can disclose information to parents. You don't need to, but you can. You can also disclose information to parents without students' consent for drug and alcohol violations if the student's under the age of 21. And often relevant when we're talking about students at risk or students of concern, FERPA has this very important health or safety exception. FERPA allows the disclosure of student information to potentially anyone in a health or safety emergency. The next slide shows what that consists of. Here's the rule. It's actually very broad in my view. If the institution finds that there's any articulable and significant threat to the health or safety of somebody, either the student we're concerned about or somebody else who might be threatened by the student, the school can disclose that information to anybody who might be helpful to protect the student or somebody else. Anybody at all, whether that's a parent or someone else in the community, the disclosure can be made to anyone. And the Department of Education has told us they are not going to second guess you. If you've got any reasonable basis for making a disclosure under the health and safety exception, the Department of Education is not going to come in after the fact and second guess you. So a very broad exception that we obviously don't want to abuse, but we want to use it and take advantage of it when that's appropriate. A couple of final points about FERPA on the next slide. There's no private right of action under FERPA. What does that mean? It means even if you were deemed somehow to have violated somebody's FERPA rights, you can't be sued for it. The only thing that can happen is someone can complain, go to the Department of Education. If the department cares about it, they will come in and tell you at most to not do it again. Their enforcement power is essentially limited to making sure that you comply with FERPA on a going forward basis. So, very long way of saying, FERPA is everywhere in the world of student privacy, but it's not something that really ought to detain us or concern us too much when we're working with students who are at risk or students who are significant concern. HIPAA, the next slide. This is easy. This used to be the thing that really raised people's eyebrows when I said it. I think now more and more people are coming around to accept this and understand this. HIPAA does not apply to student medical or mental health information at a college or university. It just doesn't. And that's because of the definition of protected health information under HIPAA. That definition has got two exceptions. It carves out anything that's in a record that's covered by FERPA, and it carves out the thing that is not covered by FERPA, which are records that are kept by a medical or mental health service for treatment only. So if you've carved out all the FERPA records and you've carved out all the non-FERPA records, you don't have anything left, and HIPAA does not apply. So HIPAA can be very important for the university if your university hospital or your health services treats employees and staff or spouses, other members of the community, but it just does not come into play in relation to students. What does come into play in relation to students are state medical privacy laws, and in some states, general privacy laws. Massachusetts, where I practice, for example, has got a general privacy statute which says you can't disclose sensitive personal information about somebody without a really good reason. It's kind of a law without a lot of teeth to it, because most people in positions of responsibility who are thoughtful don't disclose personal information without a good reason for it. More important are the basic state medical privacy laws and professional codes, the codes that apply to the various guilds, as John referred to them. You know, these laws and codes vary somewhat from state to state and from guild to guild, whether we're talking about clinicians, licensed social workers, certified rape crisis counselors, psychotherapists, physicians, whatever. But they all basically reduce to the same key points. The clinician does, of course, a basic duty of confidentiality to the patient and should not disclose patient confidences unless, here too, you get the patient consent, in which case everything is fair game within the scope of the consent, or if the disclosure is necessary to meet some sort of imminent risk. So one of the key things that we've come to work on over the years, John and Jerry or I, is this issue of consents and helping institutions think about what those consents ought to look like. When someone comes to become a first-time patient of the health service or a first-time client of the mental health service, what kind of form should we use? What kind of conversation should we have with them about the question of information sharing within the institution? Letting them know that the way we have our service, if it's an integrated service, information may be shared between mental health and medical providers when that is part of the student's treatment and care. Information might be shared with people in student affairs under certain circumstances with certain constraints. Those sorts of things can and often should be addressed up front. And then the two key takeaway points that you see on this last slide here, it's not all or nothing, and this is really a key point. As John mentioned, often I think a reaction to concerns about privacy, concerns about confidentiality, is to take the nothing option here in the all or nothing approach. If I have concerns about privacy, if I have concerns about confidentiality, and I'm not really sure whether I'm on solid ground here, I'm just not going to say anything, and then I'm going to be safe. That's not how we ought to be thinking about confidentiality and privacy in terms of helping students in the moment, not only with their care, but also consistent with that institutional message. And then the last point is, and this is really key from a risk management perspective, we've got to be on the same page. If we have a policy or an institutional philosophy that we are going to share certain information under certain circumstances among certain people, whether it's between medical and mental health providers or whether it's between any clinician and the student affairs administrators, if we have a philosophy and a policy that allows for certain sharing, it is a major, major risk to have individual players in the system who are not playing by those rules, because that is the stuff of which claims are made. The ability to share information was there, the expectation to share information was there, but somebody didn't do it for whatever reason. that is where trouble can really be caused. So we've all got to have this conversation and keep having it so that we understand how we're going to approach these issues. But once we've settled on an approach, we've all got to be all in. So that's my 2 cents, and I'll be happy to turn it back over to John.
Okay, great. And if I just speak here, people will hear me. Okay, thanks. I have way too many slides, and I'm going to go through them. I'm going to skip a few and stuff like that. But first, where my background is, as John said, organizational dynamics more recently, but I spent most of my career at the Austin Riggs Center, which is an intensive treatment facility for pretty troubled patients, and it's necessarily a team approach because we have nurses, we have social work staff, we have activity staff, and so on. So that's where I'm going to be coming from. I apologize for my voice, which I hope holds out during this. I'm also hoping it sounds more sexy than sick. But just sort of to start off with, mission. It's an important concept. You know, for me, mission has to do with not only the primary task of an organization, but a transcendent value. And yours, the mission of a university, is very broadly the education and development of your students. Because development has its challenges, the college has created a counseling service. That's why the counseling service exists. So the mission, in my mind, of the counseling service is an extension of the mission of the college. So, what is confidentiality from that angle? It's a provision to the student made by the college through its counseling service to support the student's development. That's the way I see it. It's an aspect of a trustworthy relationship in which the student may come to know himself better and take more authority for dealing with their lives. What is the developmental challenge for students? Well, all of you can say this yourselves, but separation, individuation is a huge one. You know, moving out on your own, leaving family, moving from dependence to independence, becoming competent, moving from who you are to others to who you are for yourself. And this is where Erickson's stages are wonderful, the identity stage. Who am I? What do I think? What do I feel? And where do I disagree with the people who raised me? And all that. And it moves from the preceding task of becoming competent in a world of peers to the next task of an intimate relationship, revealing yourself in a relationship with somebody you care about. From that angle, confidentiality, as I see it, is a provision of safety. It says to the student, it's safe to talk personally to me, and safe from embarrassing exposure to others, from judgment, and so on. Of course, the limits of confidentiality are also a provision of safety. The person says, I'm going to jump off the nearest bridge. Confidentiality, the limit there is a provision of safety. Erickson put it wonderfully. He talked about the distinction between play and irreversible purpose. We read these terrible stories in the newspaper. A kid is playing with a gun. You know, and kids play with toy guns. But what if it's a real gun and it goes off? All bets are off then. Irreversible purpose. And confidentiality is also a provision of safety for the therapist, too, in terms of identity, in terms of our ideals, and so on. But, and I'll go through, this is a kind of, I don't know what, this is a humorous slide in a certain sense. John and I did a presentation called To Be or Not to Be, and it reminded me that Hamlet's father was poisoned through the ear. And so what we take in through the ear can cause problems. And what confidentiality does for us and for the student can make it difficult to think clearly when difficult situations, confusing situations arise. And I want to say a little bit about the student of concern and their relationship expectations from my point of view. I said this in our July meeting, but the more healthy the student, in my experience, the more they take for granted that the adults in their environment are working together on their behalf. It's not a deal for them. The more troubled the student, the more they assume the adults in their environment do not work together, and the more they test it and the more they need it. And unfortunately, often the family system has fragmented under the weight of its own strains and been unable to provide the emotional containment and reflective functioning that the child needs in their development. So the student comes to this new environment and plays out his or her unfinished business in this new environment, which is first of all an effort to get what is needed from adults. That's why people do these, that's why people enact things. But too often it leads to a split in that new environment, for example, between the counseling service or the dean's office. And, you know, black and white choices, either or choices come into play where a both and perspective is needed. Very often it divides along the lines of empathy, this troubled student, versus accountability, as though those things can't go together. And ironically, and sometimes quite tragically, this too often replicates the split between parents who haven't been able to work together for their child. To continue this, the student often comes with a lot of anger because they haven't had developmental needs met. And so acting out at college discharges some of that anger. It spreads it around to different people. It communicates something to its targets about how authority has failed them in the past. And in a certain way, it's actually hopeful, because if it can be contained and made sense of, then the kid can understand something better. All of this, in my mind, leads to the idea that the more troubled the student, the more they need a clinical team, with each person holding to their role. From a therapy angle, the therapist and patient are the most critical team. This is what we mean by the basic therapeutic alliance. But other members of the staff team, within and outside the counseling service, form a safety net of people and important functions which support the therapy team. Unfortunately, sort of, they also provide targets for the students playing out problematic aspects of their growing up that they can't talk about yet. So somebody, in a sense, has to say back to the therapist, or the therapist needs to hear somewhere along the line, do you know what Johnny's doing over here? And has that come into the work yet? So the health service, of course, is often one of those support systems, the dean's office, and so on. So I just want to speak a little bit, in a sense, to counseling service people, but I think it's important for others to hear it, about various therapy dilemmas and how they might be worked with. You know, there's the patient who wants a guarantee the therapist won't report what he says to anybody else. And, you know, there are a lot of ways to talk about it back to the patient. And part of our point is that confidentiality is not about forms, it's about conversation. And that, in a sense, as a colleague of mine used to say, therapy happens like that. You know, you're meeting with a person for a while, but there are moments that are important. So it sounds like you think I would need to report it. It must be serious. And so on. Ways of talking to the person about this. This becomes a kind of training conversation. Then there's the situation of hearing something important about the patient from others. You know, I'll give you an example about that in a second, I think. Maybe not, but, you know, I worked in a setting where I got nursing reports every day. I generally didn't do much with them, but if something big happened, I trusted it would get through to me, and I would bring it to the patient and say primarily something like this: I heard from nursing this, but I haven't heard it from you. Something must be up between us that you didn't bring it to me. Let's talk about that, you know. If you kind of abstract principles about this, it would be paying attention to the patient's feelings and decisions. Holding to a how are they right perspective. For the person not to bring something to me, that must have made sense to them. So my first question is, you know, is noting that it must have made sense to you. Let's talk about what sense it did make. Paying attention to the therapy relationship and how the confidentiality dilemma may reflect an important issue between therapist and patient, and then exploring how that might make potential sense in their family context. And from that basis and understanding, you can work out what to do next, is my general experience. And I'll give you the example I talked about in July. A patient of mine wanted me to choose his confidentiality over the safety of his fellow patients. There was something happening in the patient community, going to happen in the patient community where I worked, that was going to be dangerous. This person knew about it, but he wasn't going to bring it elsewhere. All these patients are my patients too, in a sense. And so I had to say to the person, so you're putting me in a big dilemma here. How are we going to deal with this? What's up with this? And I first tried to explore with him his own responsibility to the rest of the patient community and what he was going to do about it. He adamantly refused, worried that he would lose face with the fellow patients, which we could also explore. I gave him a finite period of time to do something with it, or I would have to, a quite finite period of time. And we talked about that. But in the meantime, we talked about what this all meant. And what it turned out to mean, there was a moment when he said to me, "You're my therapist. Who cares what happens to them?" Then what opened up was, this was a kid born into a troubled family, firstborn, to be the savior of the family. Baby, to be the savior of the family. A gifted kid, but a kid. By the time he was 3 or 4, they started having other kids because, you know, they weren't so, this guy didn't solve all the problems. And so his rage at the other kids was enormous. And at one point he said to me, "They're supposed to be jealous of me. I'm not supposed to be jealous of them." And of course, this he was playing out with his fellow patients. These were the siblings I wasn't supposed to care about. So this is the link between the family issue and the therapy issue around confidentiality. Basically, I said, okay, now I have to bring this to the staff. I did. They worked it out in the community and so on. So that's one of the more intense issues around confidentiality. The other example I gave 3 months ago was the confidentiality of everyday family life, which the example of the 12-year-old girl who gets her first period and says to her mother, "Don't tell Dad." You know, what might she be feeling? You know, she's probably feeling things like excitement, you know, grief, I'm not a child anymore, confusion. She's also feeling, I think, that my body has done this to me and I'm not in charge anymore. So the effort to say, don't tell anybody, is an effort to hold on to control that she's lost this other way. And now it makes a lot of difference what mother says back. I mean, if mother says, "Don't be silly, let's tell him at dinner tonight," it's a disaster in a certain way. If mother says, "I wouldn't tell that womanizing bastard anything," it's a different kind of disaster. If mother says, I get it, you know, let's see what happens, you'll tell Dad when you feel right about it, you know, things go on. It's the provision of a little space, a little chance for this kid to get hold of herself. And to recognize that this is a moment, a wonderful moment that she'll want to tell Dad about soon. Of course, there are limits there too. If the girl is hemorrhaging, mother's going to say, "We've got to go to the hospital and Dad'll meet us there." You know, this is the confidentiality of everyday life. And it provides one model to think about things. So just lastly, confidentiality can be a problem in our work, but it's an opportunity. It's a provision of a transitional space in which the student might open up their private lives to their therapist, but also to themselves. This is a really important point. One of the cases we heard back in July was of a student who couldn't tell himself how much he didn't want to couldn't tell his mother how much he didn't want to be a chemistry major, and therefore couldn't tell himself about it, and simply got depressed. You know, therapy is about giving a space so you can talk to yourself in the presence of somebody else. It's, as I said, not simply procedural. It's an opportunity for discovering meaning at the boundary between the authority of the student and of the therapist. So it's a place where we do our work. And it's perfect because negotiating the boundary between self and other is exactly the task of a college student's development. So working at these dilemmas about confidentiality is a wonderful opportunity. Also, talking with each other about how you do that work is a great kind of training experience shared among yourselves with each other. So that's what I wanted to say. Thanks.
I just have a couple more slides, and then hopefully we can have a few minutes for some conversation. I know some of you may have to go, but we can stay a few minutes longer for those of you that can. These are a couple of random slides I wanted to put in because this particular article that came out in '98 in the American Journal of Psychiatry helped me enormously kind of grapple with this topic of confidentiality. This is a review article by David Lynn and George Valiant in Boston that looked at the issue of anonymity, neutrality, and confidentiality in Sigmund Freud's cases. You know, because he wrote the technical papers were the papers that said thou shalt be anonymous, thou shalt be neutral, and thou shalt be confidential. And that has been so part of all of our training as therapists. It's embedded in us, in our bones in a certain way. And it was in this paper that was happening at the time that we were presenting and learning about this, it helped me understand the link between confidentiality and mission. Because this article, I'm sorry, the print is small and so forth, but basically what the article says in these 43 cases is Freud was none of these things. In 100% of the cases, he was not anonymous. In 80-some% of the case, he was not neutral. And in 68% of the cases, he was not confidential. But the issue is that the task of psychoanalysis was to make the unconscious conscious, and to be able to have a space where somebody could bring something up, as Jerry was saying about the patient, that they didn't know they were going to bring up. They were going to bring up material that was going to bubble up in this structure of psychoanalysis. So confidentiality was about trying to give the patient confidence that this space would allow them to do that, and the therapist would handle it respectfully and in confidence, which is not the same as secrecy. It fits the task in a certain way. So this particular article was very helpful. And then his quote on this is, in that paper I wrote a long time ago, the recommendations were all of a negative nature. I considered the most important thing was to emphasize what one should not do. The study of deviations from negative recommendations is easy. But the study of deviations and adherence to complex positive recommendations about how you can usefully use this material in non-anonymous and non-confidential ways is much more difficult and complicated. But it is the task that we have working in the mission of higher education. Because here we're not just making the unconscious conscious, we're trying to help students integrate information that will facilitate them learning about and moving through these difficult impasses in their journey of establishing an authentic self. And I wanted to add this slide. Those of you may know about this. I was involved in the creation of this, a Higher Education Mental Health Alliance. This was the 9 mental health guilds that are involved in college mental health services: American College Counseling, American College Health, American Psychological, American Psychiatric, the JED Foundation, the AUCCD, the National Association of Student Personnel Administration, NASPA. All of them have a set of ethics. All of them have a set of rules about handling confidentiality. And we brought together all of those people, they still meet annually, about how to begin to have a shared view of how to do this complicated thing in college health and mental health. This was back in the day that we weren't even as integrated as we are now. We weren't to the concept of wellness. You cannot separate these two. And so this is then what I think is a sample mission of what health service is here to do. Is provide a variety of health services which will enable students to optimally engage in the complex academic, civic, and personal learning to which the college and university is committed, and to provide these services in ways that meet all of these needs as they're preparing to make contributions in their careers and communities and personal lives. The university, in this presentation I did about this, I went through and I searched all the mission statements of a number of colleges, and they all, almost to a key, had the concept of healing and wellness in them, which is sort of interesting how higher education is really committed to this. And then I want to show you the shortest one. This is the shortest mission statement I found in that search. 10 words from the University of Rochester. Learn, discover, heal, create, and make the world ever better.